Thank you for joining me today on Bless Me Meditations. Some time ago, noted atheist Lawrence Krauss made an opening statement in a debate. That opening statement was posted by an atheist YouTuber. This is my response to that opening statement by Krauss.
There are two things I want to do before I start my presentation. One was disagree with you completely. You committed the other journalistic error of saying journalists like to think there's always two sides to every story, but the great thing about science is one side is usually wrong. And the other was that you said religion and science are rivals, but that's like saying Bambi and Godzilla are rivals.
Early on in Krauss's opening statement, Krauss compares religion to Bambi and science to Godzilla. Here, Krauss is just using rhetoric based on philosophical naturalism. It does not want to allow a divine foot in the door. This statement by Krauss is not a rational argument. This statement by Krauss is not a reasoned statement. This statement by Krauss, that religion is like Bambi and science is like Godzilla, is an emotional statement aimed at people's emotions rather than their intellects. It does not address facts of the theistic position. It seeks to dismiss the theistic position entirely without any examination of the theistic position. It is seriously, in my opinion, not honest by Krauss.
So I come here not to bury God, but to praise honesty, full disclosure, and skeptical empirical inquiry, which, alas, are burying God. But that's the key thing I want to talk about. And so since I believe in full disclosure, I thought I'd give some full disclosure, which is my biases. What really matters to me is the ethics of science, open questioning, the fact that there are no scientific authorities, that we believe in honesty, transparency, reliance on evidence, peer review, and testability. All of these, I believe, make the world a better place. And they do so specifically by burying myth and superstition and dogma. Honesty and transparency are incredibly important. And what I'm going to do tonight is difficult for me, and I should have checked my time now to make sure I go about the right amount of time. I have great respect for rational and honest discussion, and no respect for distortion and misrepresentation. Dr. Craig is a fine gentleman, I'm sure, and a wonderful husband, father, etc., but probably so was George Bush. But that didn't change the fact that I detested the lies and distortion associated with his administration, and I detest the lies and distortion that have been associated with William Lane Craig, and I can't hide that. Now, we have limited time here, and I'm hoping most of the information content will come from the discussion and questions. So I can't, obviously, in 15 minutes give a comprehensive overview of science and religion, much less history, which I wouldn't attempt to do. But the real purpose of this that I want to do is raise questions, encourage discussion, motivate your skeptical thinking, and motivate you to open inquiry. And the rest is just extra.
Krauss says that he does not come to bury God, but he comes to praise honesty, full disclosure, and skeptical empirical inquiry, which he claims are things that are burying God. Then Krauss gives his full disclosure statement. Quote, the ethos of science, opening questioning, no authorities, honesty, transparency, reliance on evidence, peer review, and testability can make the world a better place by burying myth, superstition, and dogma, end quote. Another quote by Krauss, honesty and transparency, respect for rational and honest discussion, not respect for distortion and misrepresentation, end quote. Another quote by Krauss, limited time, raise questions, encourage discussion, motivate skeptical thinking and open inquiry. These were off his slides. End quote there. So in response, many atheists like Krauss refuse to acknowledge or rationalize away evidence that theists bring that point to the existence of a God. Even the different types of traditional theists will agree on some of this evidence. Some such evidence includes things that point to the fact that the universe is not eternal but had a beginning. And this fact that the universe had a beginning and is not eternal is recognized by most scientists, by many scientists today, and it's called the Big Bang. Such evidence goes on to include fine-tuning, also archaeology. Also, New Testament reliability. These archaeological findings will not regularly change as opinions in modern science regularly change. The historicity of the biblical text has been well established and will not change. Modern science regularly changes. Krauss cites testability as though that is what makes science better than theism, this testability. But Krauss forgets that the scientific method is not the only way to learn something. The scientific method is not the only way to come to knowledge about something. Materialists like Krauss miss the fact that the scientific method is not the only way to learn something. But sadly, many scientists like Krauss are unwilling to consider the alternative, that there are other ways to know things other than through the scientific method. I don't know whether or not Krauss is married, but if Krauss is married, how could he use the scientific method to determine whether or not his wife loves him?
Okay, so let's begin. The title of this thing, as you just pointed out, has one problem, but it has two problems. Has science buried God suggests that there's one God. Like the God that the people who organize this thing and William believe in is somehow special. But that's not true. There are lots of gods, and science has buried all of them. Human civilization began by putting purpose and intelligent purpose behind gods associated with the sun, the moon, the planets, the wind, the earth, the oceans. It's been, by one estimate, over 1,000 different gods throughout human history. Mars, god of war, Poseidon, Thor, all the rest. And the really important thing is that all of you, or almost all of you probably, are now atheists regarding those gods. Just the only difference is it's just one that we may disagree about. But 999, we all agree, have been thrown out. And the reason they've been thrown out is they've been buried by the rise of our physical understanding. Science works. And the fact that science works has buried the gods of the wind and the sun and the moon. Farmers now, as I was just saying, when it doesn't rain, they don't pray for rain anymore. They go see a meteorologist. And that's a good thing. In the process, the human condition has improved immensely, and it will continue to improve as science continues to bury the one remaining God.
Next, Krauss says science has buried the gods. That science has buried God suggests there's only one God, Krauss says. Krauss said it's not true that there's only one God. Theists of all stripes from the beginning have made up gods, Krauss says, forever. He says science has buried all the gods, except one. But we're working on it, Krauss says. Science said human civilization began putting an intelligence behind each of the multiple gods. Some estimate that there have been over 1,000 gods throughout history. Most people are atheists with regard to almost all of the over 1,000 gods. The only difference is there's one God we may still disagree about. Gods most of us agree do not exist. We believe do not exist because of the rise of our physical understanding of how the world and science works. Krauss says that the fact that science works has buried many of the other gods. Krauss says that as people have buried more and more gods, the human condition has improved while science continues to bury the one remaining God. As for the one God we disagree about, which Krauss referred to, the one God further objection has been addressed in a previous video on this channel when responding to Alex O'Connor's portion of this argument. There are many things about the universe in which we find ourselves that seem to point to an intelligent purpose being behind them, as opposed to a mindless, unguided process. Other videos on this channel have shown that science works because God created the universe and the world with laws that govern them in predictable ways. It is this predictability that makes it possible for atheists like Krauss and theists like Stephen Meyer to both be able to do science. People who've not shied away from the theistic implications that modern science has revealed to us understand that for the reasons already mentioned above and more, science will never bury God, and God will continue to let scientists practice their trade, while many of them, like Krauss, spit in the face of the one who gave them life, the mind with which to do the work they do, and the physical abilities with which they used to do that work. Throughout history, there have been several notable scientists. Those notable living modern scientists include Francis Collins, a renowned geneticist and former director of the National Institutes of Health. Collins is a Christian who has written and spoken extensively about the compatibility of science and faith, according to Big Think. Alistair McGrath, a biophysicist and theologian. McGrath is a prolific author who's written extensively on the relationship between science and Christianity. John Polkinghorne is an Anglican priest and theoretical physicist. Polkinghorne's another prominent figure who's explored the intersection of science and faith. Ard Lewis. Lewis is a professor of theoretical chemical physics at Oxford University. Lewis is also a Christian who's written and spoken about the relationship between science and faith. Is Mikia Corbett. Corbett is a viral immunologist who played a key role in developing Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine. Corbett is a Christian. Lastly, for this video, Catherine Hayhoe. Hayhoe is a climate scientist and evangelical Christian, and is known for her work on climate change, communication, and advocacy.
Now, this one God is supposedly left. We might ask a priori or in advance, how likely is it in advance that all those other 999 gods were false, but this one's true? Well, you might argue, if you had a flat prior, that it's probably a pretty small likelihood. But it doesn't really matter. The point is that our current understanding of nature has changed. We've learned things. It's changed and developed since the claims were made by Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. And therefore, it's natural that science is inconsistent with those claims based on ignorance. And we shouldn't revere those ancient claims as sacred. They're ignorant.
Actually, there are multiple scientific facts that have confirmed the biblical account. Some of these Iron Age peasants, much to the chagrin of people like Krauss, were inspired to write things, some of which they did not fully comprehend, that science later confirmed to be true. Scientists, who are theists, don't deny that science has much to say about how the world works. They just believe that an intelligent God created things such that people who were created in his image can use their brains and use the natural, predictable laws that God has set in motion to learn things about how the world works.
There's still many open questions. I'll try my 10 seconds of humility. It's the only time tonight. There's a lot we don't know about the universe, a lot more we don't know than we do. That's the wonder of science. That's why I'm a scientist. But it is intellectually lazy to just stop asking questions and stop looking for physical explanations and just say God did it. That's lazy.
Krauss admits that there's a lot more we don't know about the universe than we do know about the universe. That's the wonder about science, Krauss says. Krauss says it's intellectually lazy to stop asking questions and stop looking for physical explanations and just say God did it. I don't disagree with that necessarily, but that doesn't mean that you have to replace God, like Krauss appears to imply. But I also would like to say that I think it's just as intellectually lazy to say that science will figure it out. That's just as much blind faith as saying God did it appears to be. If Krauss is going to call God of the gaps intellectually lazy, then he ought to be consistent and honest and call science of the gaps just as intellectually lazy as God of the gaps. True objectivity should allow someone like Krauss to do so.
And the other thing that's important in this extra God is there's nothing special about Jesus that's any different than the other gods, or any other fictional heroes for that matter.
Krauss says there's nothing new or special about Jesus that is particularly different than the other gods or fictional heroes. This is just an inaccurate statement by Krauss. J. Warner Wallace showed in his books that Christ did not borrow from the other gods. Instead, the other gods had some but not all the attributes Christ had. Christ came after them and proved that he was what they could never be. But people like Krauss don't want to look at how Jesus is superior to every other God offered. People like Krauss don't want to take the claims of Christ seriously. People like Krauss, many of them think they have it better because now they can live without accountability for their actions if they can eliminate God from their thoughts. As long as they keep out of trouble with the law, they've got it made. But this is a dangerous mistake.
First of all, there's no empirical evidence that he was divine. None, not one iota. In that sense, he shares it with every other God that's ever been proposed.
Says that there's no empirical evidence that Jesus was divine. As I said earlier, empirical evidence is not the only type of evidence that tells us about the world. Materialistic scientists like Krauss like to scream about science and tout its merits. Much of what they say to that end is spot on. Science has a lot to offer and does do much good for the world. But it's not the only way that we can know something. Science is not the only way that one can come to know something. One has to come to grips with that reality that science is not the only path to knowledge before being able to consider the claims of Jesus or any historical claim for that matter. Without a willingness to examine the claims of Christ honestly and with an open heart, such as I submit that Krauss is not able or willing to examine the claims of Christ honestly and with an open heart, it's impossible to come to any other conclusion than Krauss's about Christ. Without a willingness to examine the claims of Christ honestly and with an open heart, it will be impossible to come to any other conclusion than Krauss's about Christ.
The myths associated with Jesus are associated with all the other myths, and the Bible. The flood myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written well before the Bible, exactly the same. The hero of the Bible was asked to create an ark and put all the species 2 by 2 on 7 levels. Same thing. Virgin birth, nothing special about Jesus. Oh, look at all these. They're all supposed to have been born of virgins. The whole story, in fact, take Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, versus Jesus. It's exactly the same. They were both born from a virgin mother. They were fathered by the king of heaven. They returned from the dead. They transformed water into wine. In fact, they, talked about eating and drinking the flesh and blood of the Creator. They were taken as a liberator of mankind. That story has been told over and over again, and this is just one of the most recent renderings. Nothing special. And the resurrection is nothing special. The myth of resurrection has been around since Osiris. Osiris was one of the major Egyptian gods, and it used to be just the kings in Egypt would be resurrected when Osiris was resurrected. But eventually, in the new kingdom, anyone could be resurrected with Osiris. I was going to say with Jesus, but it doesn't matter. If they follow the correct religious rituals, the same nonsense.
Krauss says the flood myth in the Bible is also found in other literature that was written before the Bible. Krauss says that other gods have had supposed virgin births. He mentions Dionysius, who shares multiple characteristics with Christ. Well, he says that the myth of the resurrection has been around since Osiris. All I would like to say about that at this time is that these issues have been addressed in the books of J. Warner Wallace. Many of the videos, almost all of those videos have been posted to this channel, so let me refer you to those responses.
Now, the point is that the fact that these beliefs are in fact being destroyed is related to the fact that the belief depends upon not just time, not just history, and the fact is, frankly, that in the Western world at least, the number of people who have religious affiliations monotonically going down. But it depends on where you live. If you were born in the U.S., and you're religious, you believe in the Bible and Jesus. If you're born in India and you're religious, you might believe in Brahman and who's manifest through Gensha. If you're from the Islamic world, you think the Quran is the perfect word of God and Muhammad is the latest prophet. It's kind of interesting that your belief depends on where you're from. But what's great is we live in a world where information is becoming more freely available. And because of that global access to information, we are seeing religion go down. Because people are learning that the myths and lies that they've been taught, when they learn about the rest of the world, that other people believe other myths and lies that are inconsistent with their myths and lies. And that's why we're seeing religion dying more and more.
Krauss goes on to say, what you believe about God depends on where you live. If you were born in the United States, you believe in the Bible and you believe in Jesus. If you were born in India, you believe in Brahman. If you were Islamic, you believe the Quran and you believe in Muhammad. Krauss says what's great about the world that we live in is that information is becoming more freely available. He says because more information is available, less people believe in God, and he calls that a great thing. Well, in his statements about geographic location, how it comports to belief, Krauss is making the genetic fallacy error. In my series of responses to Alex O'Connor, I did a response to this specific issue, so let me refer you to that video there instead of taking the time here.
Now, the point, and Steven Pinker, it's a quote I like, that just said, the acquisition of knowledge is hard. Our minds are prone to illusions, fallacies, and superstitions. That's the point.
Krauss shares a quote by Steven Pinker. The quote of Pinker is, quote, "The acquisition of knowledge is hard. Our minds are prone to illusions, fallacies, and superstitions," end quote. In response, I'd like to ask, what if it is the materialistic scientists and not the theists who have concocted the illusion that nothing created everything? What if it is the materialistic scientists and not the theists who have concocted the illusion that matter came from nothing, or who have redefined nothing to get something to make their wishful thinking plausible?
It was put more succinctly by Fox Mulder on the X-Files, who said, I want to believe. And the point is, we all want to believe. That's what we have to remember. And as scientists, we have to remember that we want to believe, and we have to work hard to overcome that desire to believe.
Next, Krauss says, we all want to believe in a God, and we have to work to overcome that desire to believe in a God. Krauss and others like him like to go around the country and the world telling people his stories who don't know any better to do just that, to work hard to overcome their desire to believe in a God. People like Krauss don't want to believe in God. People like Krauss want the freedom not to fear accountability for their actions. People like Krauss who in their don't want to believe that wrongdoing deserves punishment. So they come up with the theory that there is no objective morality, and basically you can call anything not wrong, or at least not have universal agreement over what wrong is. It is much easier to believe that my wrongdoing will not get judged, or it is much more pleasant to believe that my wrongdoing will not get judged, but the reality is that while we don't want the punishment we deserve, we want others to get the punishment that we intuit that they deserve. We have an innate sense of justice, and we have that innate sense of justice because God puts it in us. We see beauty in creation, and many of us make the jump that the exquisite detail and precision is less plausibly a materialistic accident of random chance and more plausibly intelligent design working with precision.
Science, we work with skepticism, open debate, honesty, transparency, knowledge, the fact that we know that we have uncertainty, and we know coincidences happen, and we require formal precision and empirical tests.
Krauss says science deals with skepticism, open debate, honesty, transparency, knowledge of uncertainty and coincidence, formal precision, and empirical tests. As previously said, science only works because the universe we live in is predictable. It is predictable because of the laws that govern it. Laws come from lawmakers. Lawmakers have minds. God is the best explanation for the mind behind the laws that govern the universe, that make the universe predictable so science can be done. Empirical tests are great and should be used for what they are supposed to be used for. Empirical tests cannot be used for everything, such as historicity and archaeology, as has been previously explained.
The residual beliefs in religion are due, in fact, in large part to the discrepancy between the laws of probability and the workings of cognition. Most people think when an accident happens to them, it means something. We're all conditioned to believe that, and we'll talk about that more later if you want in terms of miracles.
Krauss says residual beliefs in religion are due in part, at least, to the discrepancy between the laws of probability and the workings of cognition. This is a philosophical statement more than a scientific statement. Though the laws of probability can be used to show that the number of gods people have created decreases the likelihood that any one of them can be correct, an examination of each claim of deity should be done on an individual basis to determine the merits of each god. How many examinations like this has Krauss done? After doing those examinations, the genuine seeker should be able to test for the reliability of each one. At the end of all that, Christ is found by many to be the only one left remaining.
Now, I don't have enough time to do adequate justice to science, but science has continued. The evolution of science, getting rid of the gods of the sun, the moon, the wind, fire, the oceans, etc., has continued to push God away. Newton, who was a religious man, spent more time writing about God than physics, in fact. Also, however, got rid of angels pushing planets around the sun because he didn't need them. They were gone. Darwin, once he recognized natural selection and evolution, got rid of the notion of special creation for each species. You didn't need God and miracles anymore to create each species. The divine spark that caused life in the first place is not so divine. Everything we now know about biochemistry and the discovery of complex amino acids in space tells us that it's quite likely that the complex organic molecules on which life is based either arose in space or developed on Earth. We don't know the origin of life, as I'll talk about, but it's certainly plausible now that you don't need a divine spark. We don't need God to say, let there be an Earth or a moon or sun or anything. We can show from the laws of physics how all matter is created. And when it comes to the origin of the universe, we are coming remarkably close to the realization that you don't need any miracle for that either. And that's because our knowledge of the universe is changing, not because we want to get rid of God, but because the more we learn, the less we need anything outside of the laws of physics.
Krauss says we're all conditioned to believe something. Science has continued to push God away. Isaac Newton, a theist, claimed angels pushed planets around the sun. Darwin got rid of special creation through the theory of evolution. The divine spark the theists believe caused the origin of life was plausibly caused by divine chemistry. The idea that God created matter has been replaced by modern physics. The idea that God created the universe has been replaced by modern cosmology. Krauss says the more we learn through science, the less we need to invoke God. I would just like to say that while these different branches of science can tell us some of these things that Krauss says that they tell us, I think that they tell us these things because of the laws that God put in place to make science doable. I think it is just like John Lennox would say, it's not that God and science are enemies, but that they work together. Admittedly, since I'm not a scientist, but I'm only an amateur apologist standing on the shoulders of those who've come before me and who do this for their livelihood and not just a side hustle, there are people who are better qualified to speak on some of this than me. So to suffice it to say, there are giants of the faith who can speak intelligently about this.
And chemistry and biology. But it's good because science does more than that. It just doesn't just tell us about the world. It makes the world a better place. It gets rid of the vile, awful, immoral works like the Bible. The worldview that I would argue guides most of you in this room today, including those of you people of faith, which I assume is some fraction of the people in this audience. Those spiritual values of any educated person today are largely the worldview given us by science. Your worldview is vastly different than it would have been 4 centuries ago.
Krauss says science does not just tell us about the world. Krauss says science makes the world a better place. So in response to that, I'd like to say, how do we determine what makes something better? Such a qualitative statement like that seems to need an objective barometer of goodness. And theism, I think, makes a better objective barometer for goodness. Without God, goodness or badness is little more than one's subjective preference. It amounts to me liking chocolate and you liking vanilla because it's all relative. Without realizing it, Krauss is borrowing objective good and bad from theism to make his case. Krauss says the more we learn, the less we need outside of the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. That's just wrong. As I previously said, it is the consistent, reliable laws that we find in the world and in the universe that allow one to do science. Otherwise, if the laws and this planet were not predictable and reliable, on which basis could science be done? If the laws were not predictable and reliable, the volatility of the world would prevent the repetition elicited by the scientific method. The God of order is required to achieve the consistency that science depends upon. Krauss is letting his philosophical naturalism cloud his objectivity. Krauss says science gets rid of the awful, immoral works like the Bible. Many of the moral objections that one can raise about the contents of the Bible have been addressed in other videos on this channel. Can Krauss and others like him humble themselves and consider them objectively, or are their minds made up irrespective of what theists have to say? Krauss says the worldview guiding the moral and spiritual values of an educated person today is the worldview given to us by science. And this is the worldview that tells us that people are not valuable, that we're disposable, that we don't matter. It is the Christian worldview, in contrast, that says we are valuable, that we do matter.
By stripping ecclesiastical authority of its credibility on factual matters, which we've certainly done, we cast doubt on its claims to certainty in matters of morality, which is great, because we now think that women are equal to men, that we don't hate gays, all of the stupid myths that are permeated by various religions.
Krauss says that by stripping the ecclesiastical authority of its credibility on factual matters, science casts doubt on its claims to certitude in matters of morality. Science casts doubt on morality. Krauss says, since science casts doubt on morality, we can continue to have debate on moral issues, and atheistic scientists can dismiss the ethical concerns theists raise. In response, I'd like to say, without objective morality, all we can have is debate. We can never arrive at a universal standard of absolute right and wrong. We can only have my opinion versus your opinion. But the existence of police forces and governments who enforce laws reinforce that there is an absolute law and that almost every society recognizes that at its most basic level. If there is no objective morality, if someone breaks into Krauss's home and rapes his wife and kills his children, what the rapist and murderer did was not objectively wrong on atheism, but on theism it is objectively wrong. On theism, the rape and murder is objectively wrong. On atheism, it is not. Krauss says that the facts of science force us to take responsibility for the welfare of ourselves, our species, and our planet. Krauss implies that theists don't think men and women are equal. Krauss implies that theists hate gays, and this is just flat out wrong and a misrepresentation. Now, I'm sure that there are some within the Christian community to where that inflammatory statement by Krauss could be applied. It should not be applied to any Christian. No Christian should hate gays. No Christian should think men and women are unequal. No Christian should think that men are superior to women. Christians should believe that men and women are equal. Christians are responsible to love all people regardless of their beliefs or sexual orientation. Krauss is just spilling ignorant hatred and lies to misrepresent Christians to get people to hate Christians like he does. Christians should love their enemies, including atheists, like Krauss. Christians should love their enemies. Christians should love atheists, like Krauss. Many atheists, like Krauss, do what Krauss does regularly. They make straw men and attack the straw man and misrepresent the true Christian position. Unfortunately, many atheists who presently have no interest in honestly examining Christianity's claims, because of some church hurt, have latched on to these blatant misrepresentations and have successfully quieted their consciences. Christians need to pray for people like Krauss, that people like him would become more like J. Warner Wallace and would turn from atheism and turn to Christ.
The facts of science, moreover, force us to take responsibility for the welfare of ourselves, our species, and our planet. And that is what we need to do in the 21st century. Now, Dr. Craig is an apologist, and there's good reason to apologize. One of the first apologists in the year 208 wrote, this is great, "The Son of God died just because it is absurd, it is to be believed. And he was buried and rose again. It is certain because it is impossible." That's the rationality of an apologist. Apologists often conjure up a veneer of rational justification and evidential support for their God by distorting and misrepresenting results of science and logic, something Dr. Craig does exceptionally well. In doing so, they do a disservice to everyone, including people of faith, which is why I came here, because the people of honest faith should recognize when things are being distorted.
Krauss quotes the Christian apologist Tertullian and seems to imply that apologists are irrational. Krauss asserts that apologists appear to have rational justification and evidential support for their theistic position, but Krauss asserts that theists distort or misrepresent the results of logic and science. Krauss says apologists do a disservice to everyone, including fellow theists. Well, in response to this, I'd like to say that what I just said about atheists distorting and misrepresenting Christians seems to apply here as well. Some atheists are also irrational to think that order and design did not come from intelligence. Some atheists are also irrational to think that the order and design that was required to get the universe going and to sustain the universe arose by random chance than arising by intelligence. This belief by Krauss and many atheists is perhaps the most irrational of all. Krauss does not want people to be able to examine the claims of Christianity objectively and honestly, so he makes up lies to get his eager audience looking to escape something about religion or theism a way out and permission to do so. If he can get them angry at Christianity and Christ and theism, he can make them want to escape, as he perhaps did.
St. Augustine once said, if you want to go out and convince the heathen of your God, you better show that you're not lying about the real world. We need to bury God for a bunch of reasons. This is the God we need to bury. In Deuteronomy, he said, kill all men and women. He told the Israelites, kill all the men and women in a conquered city, all the men in a conquered city, and seize the women, children, and livestock as plunder. But in the cities of these people, you should kill absolutely everybody. Now, we live in a world where you can't preach, in the modern world, in the non-fundamentalist world, where you can't preach genocide anymore because we buried God. You can't, and if someone drowns their children in a bathtub because they say God is talking to them, we put them in a mental institution.
Krauss says we need to bury God. He cites Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 13 to 17 without any context. He then expresses moral outrage about the passage from Deuteronomy that God would command his people to kill people, and steal livestock. In response to this, I would just like to say that there are tons of context considerations that Krauss failed to take. He trusts that most of his audience will never deeply study the passage he quoted like he probably did not study it, and then will be equipped to parrot the lies he has just spouted.
Now, Dr. Craig loves children. But to go to the lengths of enforcing belief, this is what he says, to justify this. Why take the lives of innocent children? If we believe, as I do, that God's grace is extended to those who die in infancy or as small children, the death of these children was actually their salvation. Therefore, God does these children no wrong in taking their lives. It gets worse. He went on, said, who does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites? Not the Canaanite adults, for they were corrupt and deserving of judgment. They deserve to die. Not the kids, because they inherit eternal life. Who are the really people that we should suffer for? The poor soldiers who had to kill them. If that isn't obscene enough, Dr. Craig then, a third time, went back and thought about this and said, you know what, I've come to appreciate as a result of a closer reading of the biblical text that God's command to Israel was not primarily to exterminate the Canaanites, but to drive them out of the land. If they just left, no one had been killed at all. Only those who remained were to be utterly exterminated. Oh, that's great. That obscenity is the reason that my friend and colleague Richard Dawkins will not appear on stage with this man.
Then Krauss quotes William Lane Craig, who was quoted as saying it was not wrong for the Canaanite adults to be killed due to their sin. It was not wrong for the Canaanite children to be killed due to their inheritance of eternal life by dying. It was Craig who said that it was the soldiers who were wronged. If the Canaanites had just left the land, none of them would have had to be killed. I'm sure there might be Christians who disagree with Craig. In response, I'd like to say that I'm sure that there are Christians who would disagree with Craig. But the Canaanite issue is perhaps the most difficult issue of all the Old Testament issues. I went into a deeper dive on this issue when I went through Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? Please see the videos on the Canaanites from that book on this channel. Much more time needs to be spent on the Canaanite issue than Krauss spent in his video and than I can give in a response like this.
Now, The key thing that I want to emphasize, that will go on in the discussion that's going to happen, because I've been in a debate with Dr. Craig, is a misrepresentation about use of science to justify belief. Now, some apologists are better than others. Here's one who's kind of not so good at it.
You know, one of the age-old questions of science is what keeps the nucleus together. Remember, the nucleus consists of a bundle of protons and neutrons. Now, protons have a positive charge. What do positive charges do? They repel each other. So you've got these protons in the very nucleus of the atom, and atoms are the building blocks of the entire universe, and yet at the very center of the atom, you have a multiplicity of protons that ought to repel each other. They ought to be driven apart. There ought to be no way you can keep them together. And scientists have pondered since they first understood the makeup of the atom, what is it that holds the nucleus of the atom together? How does that thing stay together? What holds it together? They've been looking for what scientists call the nuclear glue that keeps them from flying apart. Well, now we know. Now we know what the glue is that holds together the entire universe and keeps it from flying apart. It is Jesus Christ. In him.
Okay, I think I can stop him there. Okay, you got the subtle problem. Now, the point is, if you don't know anything about nuclear physics, you might even say that's a big mystery that scientists don't know anything about. But we understand exactly what holds a neutron and proton together, the strong force. A Nobel Prize was given for it. Calculations can be done. But if your audience is scientifically ignorant, you can make it appear as if you're scientific. Now, Dr. Craig is much more refined and intelligent than that man, I can say, having spent time with him. But that doesn't mean he doesn't use the same techniques. When you can't check his facts, or he doesn't think you know them, he will lie.
Krauss plays a clip from Brian Fisher, a host of Focal Point. In the clip, Fisher talks about how a nucleus of an atom has protons that should repel each other. Fisher asks what holds the nucleus together. Fisher says scientists have been looking for the nuclear glue that keeps the protons from flying apart. Fisher says the glue that holds the universe together and keeps it from flying apart is Jesus Christ. Fisher was not done talking. Krauss cuts him off. In the clip, Krauss says, in contrast to Fisher, that scientists know exactly what holds neutrons and protons together. He calls it the strong nuclear force. Krauss says that if your audience is scientifically ignorant, you can say something and appear scientific like Fisher was trying to do. Krauss accuses Craig of lying. I don't think that Fisher was trying to appear scientific in making that statement. But I think that Krauss's quote mining of Fisher was sad. I agree with Krauss, and I agree with Fisher. From the Christian perspective, Christians can rightly say that Christ upholds all things. One of the ways he does that is by the creation and sustaining of the strong nuclear force. For more on this channel about the strong nuclear force, please see the following on my channel.
And here's an example that comes close to home. There's a movie that just came out about Richard Dawkins and me called The Unbelievers. I was amazed to discover Dr. Craig did not one, not two, but 3 podcasts on the movie and wrote a review. The movie hasn't been distributed yet. So I was amazed that he'd seen it. When at first I thought, well, maybe he stole the movie and then he was a thief. Or maybe he just lied about seeing the movie, in which case he's a liar. Maybe he's a thief and a liar. Well, the remarkable thing is you can't see the movie, so you can't see what's wrong. But let me play these 2 clips.
For example, there's a very, I think, uncharitable exchange between Dawkins and Cardinal Pell concerning evolutionary theory, where Dawkins clearly tries to set Pell up to embarrass him. He says to him, "Do you believe that human beings are evolved from apes?" And Pell answers, "Probably so." And then Dawkins says, "Do you believe then that human beings are evolved from Neanderthals?" And Pell says, "Probably so." And then Dawkins springs the trap. Well, that shows you don't understand evolutionary theory, because Neanderthals are not ancestors of human beings, of Homo sapiens. They are our cousins, not our ancestors, attempting to show Pell's ignorance of evolutionary theory. So this was clearly an attempt by Dawkins to simply set up and embarrasses an opponent in an unfair way.
Next, Krauss plays clips from William Lane Craig. In the first clip, played by Krauss, Craig narrates a conversation he was retelling from a Cardinal Pell and Richard Dawkins. Craig says Dawkins asks Pell if Pell believes human beings are evolved from apes. Craig says Pell answers probably so. Dawkins next asks Pell if Pell believes human beings are evolved from Neanderthals. Pell says probably so. Craig says Dawkins springs the trap and accuses Pell of not understanding evolutionary theory because Dawkins says Neanderthals are not ancestors of Homo sapiens. Craig shared that Dawkins says Neanderthals are our cousins, not our ancestors. Craig says this was an attempt by Dawkins to set up and embarrass Pell in an unfair way. Many atheists will do what Dawkins did to Pell, try to set them up to make them look bad. These atheists justify doing so because they think they have the moral justification to do so. They should not go out of their way to make atheists look bad like atheists try to do to Christians all the time. It amounts to bullying by the atheists, but Christians have also been guilty of such bullying, and Christians should not stoop to those tactics.
Do you accept that humans evolved from apes?
Yeah, probably. From Neanderthals, yes.
Bill, another point is Krauss's statement about Darwin. Krauss said that Darwin showed the origin of life is not a miracle.
Isn't that a remarkable statement? Darwin showed that the origin of life is not a miracle. Darwin had nothing to say about the origin of life. So this is just a scientific error on Krauss's part in this film.
That there's some similarity. Before Darwin, life was a miracle. You couldn't ask the question, where did the diversity of life come from? It was a miracle. It was design. What Darwin showed were very simple laws of biology. Natural selection and genetic mutation, essentially, could produce all the diversity of life, the complexity we now see, from very simple beginnings, with no miracle. Now, at the time he did he prove it? No. But it was plausible. Now there's been 150 years of proof. Now we take it to the next step. Do we know how the first forms of life started? Absolutely not. But it's certainly plausible that, given everything we know about genetics, biochemistry, that chemistry, by natural processes, can turn into biology. Do we know that? No, but it's plausible, and that's worth celebrating, that you don't need miracles.
Okay, now I should wrap up. I was going to show some other clips having to do with, in fact, claims by Dr. Craig about the fact that animals don't suffer, and a beautiful film that's produced online, which you should look at, which showed that in fact his claims were spurious. Then he produced a podcast arguing against them, and then they did a wonderful clip or film that showed in fact that his claims were in fact lies. And in fact, my favorite part is one statement where he says, as scientifically informed philosopher, it's much better to talk about these neuroscience issues than a philosophically naive neuroscientist. And then, to compound that, he writes to a different audience, this is not an issue of theology, it's only neuroscience. But let me just conclude. I'm not going to show these clips out of deference to the time constraints, even though they're great, and maybe we can have time for them later. But I just want to summarize. Knowledge about the physical world has buried already almost all the gods. There's nothing different about Jesus or Christianity.
Krauss submits other clips he wanted to show and moves to a summary. Krauss says knowledge about the physical world has buried almost all the gods. Krauss says there's nothing special about Jesus or about Christianity. And I would just like to say that it's not true that there's nothing about Jesus or Christianity that's special. That's not true. I've spent a few years now showing that's not the case. And I've got, well over 100 videos demonstrating that that's not true.
The process of science overcomes our natural tendencies to believe in myth and superstition and replace dogma with knowledge that works. We need to bury God to produce a better moral and ethical world.
The process of science, Krauss says, overcomes our natural tendencies to believe myth and superstition and replaces dogma with knowledge that works. Krauss says we need to bury God to produce a better and more ethical world. A better moral and more ethical world. And I would like to say that's far from accurate. In fact, Eric Metaxas in his book, Is Atheism Dead? He says he shows in multiple ways how it was the atheism that undergirded Nazi Germany that showed that what can happen on the atheistic worldview is a horrific thing. I'll show some screenshots here about that.
We must openly call out lies and distortions, even if it's uncomfortable, as it was, believe me, tonight. We should foster open questioning, refutation by others, and no false claims of certainty. That is incredibly important.
Krauss says we must openly call out lies and distortions, even if it is uncomfortable. And in this response, I've attempted to call out those lies and distortions that Krauss has made in this video when he misrepresented and strawmanned Christians. Krauss says we should foster open questioning, refutation by others, and no false claims of certainty. But isn't Krauss claiming that he's certain that there's no God and that science will eventually have all the answers? Isn't that what the theory of everything is?
Finally, bearing God is not a bad thing. It's not a negative thing. Science provides gifts in return. The universal invitation to question anyone's claims and the universal requirement, to exercise due diligence and the duty of care to substantiate those claims. And my main purpose tonight, in fact, the most important purpose in any lecture I give, my chief goal tonight is to encourage the broad use of these gifts, independent of the question we're talking about tonight. Thank you very much.
Krauss says that burying God is not a bad thing. Krauss says science provides gifts in return, the universal invitation to question anyone's claims and the universal requirement to exercise due diligence and duty of care to substantiate those claims. I think there is evidence for theism. The traditional monotheists, Islam, Jewish people, Muslims, Jewish people, and Christians, monotheists, can point to the same evidence to arrive at the conclusion that there is a God. The Christian goes a step further and attaches deity to Jesus Christ and calls Jesus God and says that he is the only source of eternal life, that anyone who puts their faith in something or someone other than Christ alone does not have eternal life. So the evidence for the truth of Christianity is an expansion of the evidence for traditional theism. And I would invite any of my listeners to examine the claims of Christ and trust Christ for eternal life. There are plenty of more developed, seasoned apologists than me out there on YouTube who can put together some more high-tech and fancy-looking things. But I think we share the same goal, and that's to glorify Christ and to make him known and show that he is worthy of our devotion and adoration and submission. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day. I see the evidence.